So just a reminder, in terms of where we are right now in the course, we are returning to a topic that we were discussing in the week number 5, I believe it was. Economic activity, broadly construed, and the relationship between faith and economy after foray into relationship between or the place of the person of faith within the context of globalized world today, how to bring to bear faith convictions on the world affairs, and then 2 sessions on couplet of religion and violence and religion and reconciliation. We're turning back to faith and business, this time concentrating not so much on the large macro picture, but on an individual corporation. And to introduce this session, we will have, as last time also, Joel Podolny.
All right, good to see you all again. So in week 6, right, we focused on the macro level considerations in terms of the relationship between economy on the one hand and spirituality and faith-based attitudes on the other, looking in particular at the China case. Here we have, as you know from the conversations you've already had this week around Cadbury, Voices of Iraq, that the focus is now very much on the organization and how and whether or not and what are the ways in which values, social commitments can be or should be implemented at the level of the organization. I'll begin by making essentially sort of 6 observations to hopefully set the stage for our visitors today. And then we'll just go from there. So observation number 1, being sort of a sociologist, an empirical sociologist at that, I'm going to begin just with kind of the empirical fact, may have been discussed in some of your sessions. While there's a lot of talk about whether or not there's a positive empirical relationship between being socially responsible as a corporation and profitability, there is absolutely no evidence that the scholars at the leading institutions would regard as compelling on this point. There are so many counter examples that are out there that just as an empirical fact, it seems a very hard one to sustain. So the argument that corporations will be or should be socially responsible just because it is profitable for them to do so is difficult to sustain. Now, if it turns out that you find yourself in a cocktail party conversation with somebody who insists that the evidence is there, usually when the evidence is, it's evidence in a cross-section and causality is very hard to determine. If, for example, somebody told you that very profitable corporations are likely to give better healthcare benefits to their workers than unprofitable corporations, you'd have no problem concluding that maybe the causality is reversed, and if you're very profitable, you can afford to give good healthcare benefits, and if you're not profitable, then you can't. That's always a pretty strong counter for any of the empirical relationships that have been observed. So that's point number 1. But so given that there's no kind of conclusive evidence on the empirical relationship, there obviously is evidence that leaders of for-profit corporations can be values-based in their actions without it necessarily coming at the expense of shareholders, especially if those values are a motivation for their employees, right? So the fact that there's not a relationship in general doesn't mean that an individual leader of an organization can decide there's some values I'm going to be committed to, and I am going to work to be smarter and work harder, and in particular can draw employees who may be motivated by the particular set of values I'm going to drive forward. Now, the fact that it may apply for one firm in an industry, right, so it doesn't necessarily mean it could apply for all of them, right, because you can get selection effects in the beginning, right? If you are the best if you're the best chocolate manufacturer in controlling your supply chain, you draw employees from the others because they all want to work for you. there's a limit probably to the number of firms that would apply to in the industry. Now, and now, having said that, even when it's a motivation for employees, it can come at some cost, which is, if you were taking strictly the perspective of the shareholders, it would come at, which is, even if you get these motivated employees who are willing to accept lower pay because they're getting to wake up every morning and work for a company that's consistent with their values, it's also the case that then the company's brand usually can be held hostage by NGOs in ways that then could be problematic for the shareholders. Nike's a good example here on this. If you talk to those NGOs who were most concerned about Nike's supply chain practices, most of them, I think, having written cases on this at the time, most of them would have admitted that Nike was not necessarily the worst offender. It just had the best brand. And in particular, it had employees who, they work for Nike because they got to go tell their friends, I work for Nike. And they consume that. And Phil Knight, who I interviewed as part of this case series I did at Nike, said, the thing that hurt the hardest was not that consumers were necessarily buying less shoes. It was that our employees' motivation was fundamentally tarnished. That from working for a company that was associated with sort of health and sport and kind of this rebellious anti-establishment quality, we started to look like we were a tobacco company, right? It was essentially what he said. So if it's possible, right? If there are examples that we can point to of organizations where the leaders of their organizations have run them in a way that they can sort of drive values that are considered, there's still an implementation question. And one of the things, we've got Christine Bader here, and I'll give Christine a fuller introduction in a second, but she's been working at BP, and I know I've got the notes right here, but she's been in charge for a number of years, but she's been in charge of policy development at BP since 2004. And was at BP really at the time that John Brown was very much trying to implement a set of values that were that he believed in, and Christine will talk about that. So that's the second point, right? Is leaders can be value-based. It can be hard. It doesn't necessarily result in more profits, but there's still the implementation questions. The third, and just to tie this to the readings. The standards that you've got around, some of the readings you have basically are providing ethical standards that we can sort of think about. So there's the reading by Sen, there was the reading by Kung, the ethical framework. I guess I would say two things about these frameworks. As a practical matter, right, and you must have seen this in the Cadbury case, they don't provide a huge amount of guidance, right? For questions like, how much due diligence should you be doing with respect to your supply chain? They don't provide a lot of guidance for questions on, the living wage and exactly what should the living wage be, or doing business in countries that allow discrimination on the basis of gender, right? When you get to almost any very specific question. Having said that, what the frameworks do is they create a vernacular, they create a language. And to the degree to which it's a cohesive set of ideas underlying the framework, they potentially also, or they provide not just the language, but a framework for a conversation. Now, that can take place between businesses, NGOs, government, that any of those constituencies and the broader populace as well can use for thinking about either what laws should be in place, what corporations should be doing. The question is given a framework, how does it get enough moral authority to actually be invoked by enough people or enough institutions to have an impact in the world, right? It certainly helped when Sen won the Nobel Prize. That kind of adds to your moral authority, right? The other thing that Christine has been working on is with the human John Ruggie at the UN around developing sort of a standard. And there you've got the UN's sort of seal of approval as potentially something else that would enable this framework for the conversation. But I think in no case, and you certainly saw in the readings, is there going to be a lot of guidance that you can sort of apply it as a decision tree analysis. It's like, okay, if these are the rights you believe in, therefore this is how much resources you should devote to your supply chain. So you've seen some normative frameworks. Christine will talk about the others. And then sort of the fifth point that I guess I would make is, even if corporations care only about narrow profit maximization, they need to understand the impact that globalization has on the identities of individuals because of the potential backlash against those corporations. I mean, that's essentially the point of the Friedman rating, right? That the drive of globalization associated with the Lexus, right, provokes identity-based defense mechanisms, would be one way to sort of articulate it, that are associated in that particular story with the olive tree. So even as sort of a pragmatic consideration, sort of understanding that sociological dynamic is important. And with that, I think I realized I said I was going to do 6 points. I think I'm going to save one. So I'll turn it over to Tim to talk about this essentially just the basic question of what can we and should we be able to expect of corporations, because the remarks I've been giving so far today have said something about what leaders as individuals can do, have said about what frameworks can do to create a context for a large number of constituencies, but at least to this point I haven't said anything about what we can and should expect from corporations independently of individuals, and that's the point that obviously the Friedman reading sort of raises probably more saliently than any of the rest. But Tim will take it from there.
So that actually made it a lot simpler. So the answer is nothing.
Right.
I'm going to leave. I'm going to write this down though first. Nothing. How do you spell nothing? That helped a lot. So Professor Wolf made me this time write down what I was going to say so that he could censor it so that it would be available for the videotape for future generations. So
you made him write down nothing.
He thought I was going to go to sleep at 11 o'clock at night, but I didn't. So there's another version. Only slightly more provocative. So I
still
guess
have the power of shutting you down. Go
you
for it,
think
Tim.
you have the power of shutting. So I'm allowed to have a preamble, and then I guess he's going to tell me how deeply wrong I am. But with my now edited preamble, I'd say that I am really interested in the discussion about how to make the world a better place. But what I'm not interested in, and I think it's an important discussion now because the world's a shambles, on almost every level. And I am staggered by every day a new revelation. We just were looking at the market. General Electric's at $14 a share. Apple is now at 12. It was at 22 when we first looked, on its way to 0. However, as interested as I am in that discussion, for me, a discussion about responsible behavior to be valuable has to meet two really simple preconditions. One, it has to really talk about the difficult issues, not the mushy, simple issues like, do we want to have human slavery? It's got to talk about the difficult, really gnarly issues that will face all of you every day if you're awake enough to realize it. And secondly, it's got to have, that discussion has to be done with, I think, precision and rigor and clarity. And that sounds trivial, but as I've read through much of the course material and had lots of these discussions, I find that the discussion really meets those two simple tests. So Professor Wolf has forbidden me to wander off into the quagmire of the really basic questions of meta-ethics or political legitimacy. But I couldn't come and sit here without warning you that much of this debate about normative questions glosses over the really profound and controversial issues of this kind. So, for instance, I'd like to know, before we're done, what Professor Wolf thinks Mill or Kant would say about a pyramid of values, which I find as woolly and mushy a concept as they come. So we'll wait with bated breath for that. So in my allocated time, I'd like to introduce, in my few minutes, the ideas in Unger, the allegory from Plato, the Milton Friedman. I didn't bother with Thomas Friedman. The Milton Friedman, Dunning and Greenspan. And let me just start with Unger. Unger uses two, what I think are incredibly powerful examples to highlight the tension in making everyday individual normative decisions. And Unger obviously has a much bigger project, but I'm forbidden to talk about that one. But the examples are powerful, as is the simplicity of his message. His message, in my reading, is that making normative decisions is really hard. Making them on behalf of other people is even harder. So let me read you, on the chance that you didn't already read, the two Unger Singer. I think Singer was the inspiration for The Shallow Pond. The Shallow Pond, the path from the library at your university to the humanities lecture hall passes a shallow ornamental pond. On your way to give a lecture, you notice that a small child has fallen in and is in danger of drowning. If you wade in and pull the child out, it will mean getting your clothes money and either canceling your lecture or delaying it until you can find something clean and dry to wear. If you pass by the child, then while you'll give your lecture on time, the child will die straight away. You pass by, and as expected, the child dies. Then his brackets this example with the UNICEF envelope. In your mailbox, there's something from UNICEF. After reading it thoroughly, you correctly believe that unless you send in a check for $100, and instead of each child living many more years, over 30 more children will die soon. But you throw the material in the trash basket, including the convenient return envelope. I always like that, including the convenient return envelope provided. You send nothing, instead of living many years, over 30 more children soon die, and because you didn't send the requested $100. So Unger spends a lot of this book, Living High and Letting Die, about how similar these dilemmas are, that they're not actually as ridiculously opposite as they seem. And I think for me, that is really emblematic of how really difficult, if you think hard about the moral dilemmas that you face every day. We talked about giving $2,000 to Johnny Isaacson. It was an unbelievably difficult calculation to conclude that that was the right thing to do. And these things happen every day. And so I guess the message of Unger for me is that these aren't really just hypothetical exaggerations for a really fascinating philosophical debate about meta-ethics or other things that I'm not allowed to talk about. It's really a great example that every day we make decisions to whether we should save General Motors or intervene in Darfur, or whether we should reduce capital gains taxes or cure ALS. So making these kind of choices on your own bat is hard enough. Making them on behalf of others, whether it's governments or corporations, is really, really hard. Now I thought I'd turn quickly to what I'm supposed to talk about, and that is how the real world works. And I have taken this example of the Ring of Gyges out of its proper context. Plato proves, I'm sure decisively in the dialogue, that it's best to be virtuous. And I guess I'm sure he's right. I could never quite figure it out, but I'm sure it's right. But for me, this allegory, and leaving it where we've left it, is good enough to make a point about a concept that I find really troublesome, and that is the concept of enlightened self-interest. Seems to me that enlightenment has no hold over self-interest. As far as I can tell, there are basically two accounts of enlightened self-interest. One argument claims that you'll be, in the long run, better off if you follow the enlightened path. And I guess I'm not supposed to say the story about Lady Astor and Winston Churchill, so I won't. But it ends by Winston Churchill just haggling, saying that they're just haggling over price, and I'll let you could figure the rest of it out. So this argument about enlightened self-interest, to me, is circular, and in fact, it's just self-interested with a great PR campaign. The second case is a slightly better one, and that is the argument that the world would be better off if we behave in an enlightened way, and we'll somehow indirectly benefit and be better off as well. There's still problems with this. First, either we're willing to be less well off, and this seems to conflict with the notion of self-interest, or not, or it requires one of these great empirical studies that I think is probably impossible to do, that in some remote way we're going to all be better off because the world's a better place if we fill the UNICEF envelope way far away in Sudan, 300 children live, that somehow or other will be better off. Seems to me to be untenable. So, and we take Gaiji's, the best thing to be, obviously, is to be completely self-interested, but invisible, so that you can, steal and pillage, lie and, cheat, but still be perceived as virtuous because of your generosity when you're no longer invisible. That's, I think, to be greedy and selfish, but to be perceived as generous and virtuous must, on the self-interest calculator, be close to nirvana. So I think these things are mushy notions, enlightened self-interest. And then when you go one step further and try to lodge the idea of responsibility in a corporation, and the idea now of corporate social responsibility, I guess I could say really simply, I just agree with Milton Friedman. This may be the only thing I've ever agreed with Milton Friedman on, but I agree with Milton Friedman. I think he argues decisively that the corporation or its management cannot be held in their roles as corporation or agents of the corporation for making normative choices beyond those that impact its future profitability. Corporations might well follow the notion of enlightened self-interest, which is reducible to a good PR campaign, and it may, in fact, that PR campaign result ultimately in profit maximizing outcomes. However, I don't think we can ask the agent of a corporation owned by a diverse group of owners who have only one objective in common, that is a desire to make profits, to fill the UNICEF envelope on behalf of its owners. Each owner can make the choice of their dividends or capital gains. It's really hard for me to agree with Milton Friedman. But in this case, I think he's, it's not a very controversial conclusion. Let me just finish by saying that the reason I thought it would be helpful to read the Greenspan testimony, especially bracketing Milton Friedman, is that while I think the notion of corporate social responsibility is mushy and of little value, I think Greenspan's testimony is a complete indictment of the worldview held by many economists, and especially Republicans, who rely on markets as the ultimate source of wisdom. That mythological, invisible hand is pretty discredited these days, and hopefully decisively discredited. Miroslav and I have agreed to help Dunning with his notion of responsible global capitalism by saying that we agree, and he agrees with Greenspan's admission, the invisible hand is neither perfect, omniscient, or omnipowerful. So I'm past my time that Miroslav gave me, but let me just tell you the 6 things that I learned by reading all of the things that you've read and some of the things that I read in addition. 1, making these choices are really hard. 2, enlightened self-interest is of no help. 3, vesting authority and responsibility in corporations is nonsensical. 4, as Greenspan finally admitted, free markets need regulation. 5, the locus of normative choices is the individual or governments which rely for their legitimacy on alignment with the values of the individuals they represent. And 6, as Dunning says, other institutions have an important role in developing a more moral global environment and educating individuals on making normative decisions.
Sounds great, Tim. You know, the only real challenge that you issued was about this pyramid of values. And I'll let the pyramid of values pass. I think I can happily agree with good gist of what Kant is saying and still think that the pyramid of values of Dunning is a useful thing for what he's trying to achieve. But that's going to be a conversation that you and I am going to possibly have for another occasion. And I think the time is now probably ripe for us to give Christine Bader floor. Joel, do you want to introduce Christine? Yeah. Tim has been already in the class. He, I think, needed no introduction in that sense to the class. So, but I think it would be useful and helpful if Christine were to be properly introduced.
Christine, I met first because she's a School of Management alum, and she's been on the board of SMAA. But she's, you know, her role, and I mean, she really is in a lot of ways, you know, kind of the embodiment of what we talk about at the School of Management when we talk about educating leaders for business and society in this role that she has played at BP since 2004. And I've had the opportunity to visit with Christine at BP and talk to her over the years. And she's had to give a lot of thinking, very hard thinking, about how a corporation that, due to the activity it does and where it does that activity, has to face a lot of these very complex moral questions every day. And so it's why, just by itself, why I'm thrilled she could be here. But she's also, while she's doing that, she's also been working with John Ruggie, who's been the UN Special Representative on Business and Human Rights, and has been working with him to develop the normative framework for thinking about rights that the UN essentially wants to put its seal of approval on. And then she does a whole bunch of other stuff. But she's got 2 jobs, so that's there you go. That's Christine. She's a great person too.
You've been defined.
What? Maybe I shouldn't say anything at this point. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Hi. What I'm going to do then, given the way that this conversation is set up, I'm going to just walk through what I've done since leaving SOM. And in doing that, hopefully touch upon a lot of these issues of implementation and of frameworks, and then we can get into it however you want to get into it. So I had done 5 years of nonprofit and government work between undergrad and coming to SOM. Joined BP for a summer internship in 1999 and in headquarters in London, and then joined full-time after graduation and went straight out to Indonesia. And I was supposed to be splitting my time using my new hard-nosed MBA skills and doing commercial analysis. This was not long after BP had taken over ARCO. So BP was reviewing a lot of ARCO's assets in Indonesia, trying to decide, you know, what to spin off, what to sell, what to keep, what to do with it all. So that was supposed to be my primary role, but they said, listen, because of some of this other NGO and government stuff you'd done, maybe you can help out with the social and environmental review around this one project in particular, a liquefied natural gas plant that we're building in West Papua, because there seem to be some issues there that we need a little bit more attention paid to. So I started doing that, and that ended up being my full-time job, and then my niche and really my calling, frankly. Because this plant, so it's in West Papua, which is quite remote. There's a bay there, and there's a very large gas field. And so this project would extract the gas. There'd be a short subsea pipeline built to an onshore processing plant. And this would compress the gas, freeze it so that it could be loaded up on tankers and shipped out to whoever bought it. So this project, technically, it was very straightforward. BP's built LNG plants all over the world. but never in a place like this. So this project had every environmental and social tripwire for disaster. So it was in the world's, one of the world's largest intact mangrove forests, which meant that it was really swampy. So one of the few places where you could build a $2 billion plant was a little bit above water level, solid ground, which meant that it was also one of the few places in the area where it was feasible to live. So there was a village there of about 150 families, which the Indonesian government said, this is, you know, what's the big deal? We'll just move them. So BP was then getting caught into this resettlement issue as well. By national law, the Indonesian military would be protecting the project. The Indonesian military is not known for their good community relations, so BP would be stuck in the middle of that. So anyway, so what on earth would we do? Right, so we commissioned a bunch of impact assessments, and I could talk about this in great detail, but point being that we had to kind of start from scratch. There was no framework for the company. I mean, we had these values and we support the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but we didn't really know how to put that into practice. So we did lots of impact assessments, brought in lots of external experts to advise us at an international level, a national level, a local level, really anybody who would work with us. And came up with a kind of development plan in collaboration with some of the local communities. And so my job there was to, you know, hire people who would serve as our community liaisons, to, again, commission lots of these studies and establish partnerships with organizations. So we've done some really innovative work there, but it's a long-term effort. The project's going to be there for at least 30 or 40 years. And the outcomes are not within the company's control. But we've done, again, we've tried to be proactive and creative, and only time will tell. So from there I moved to China, and I did similar work around a joint venture, a 50-50 joint venture that BP has with Sinopec, which is one of China's state energy companies. And we're building a chemicals plant on the outskirts of Shanghai municipality, which gets quite rural. So it was a town of about 30,000 people, and the workforce would peak at about 40,000 migrant workers, men from other parts of the country. So might be some issues there. So again, I was to do a social impact assessment to help ensure that there are adequate standards, health and safety standards for the dormitories for the workers. But again, there was no real framework or guidance for how to do this. Again, we're kind of creating it there based on the needs of that particular project. So from there I moved to London, and after a year doing some more commercial analyst stuff, so that you know, I didn't forget how to use Excel, but anyway, I rejoined our group vice president for strategy and policy development. And after a few months working for him, he asked me to focus on human rights. And he admittedly didn't know what that meant, but there seemed to be a lot going on with respect to business and human rights. So a number of our projects in difficult places were ramping up at the same time. So the project I was on in Indonesia was finally starting major construction. We had a big similar project in Angola, which was starting major construction. We were starting to see first oil pop out of this pipeline that we were building across Azerbaijan, Turkey, and Georgia. And all these projects, rightly, were attracting the attention of human rights groups. And then, so that was sort of some internal factors. And then externally, there seemed to be a lot going on about business and human rights. So there was a debate over this proposed set of standards going on at the UN, which I'll talk about in a second. Our industry association had set up a human rights task force. There was something called the Business Leaders Initiative on Human Rights, which was picking up steam. So there seemed to be a lot going on. So we said, basically, go figure out what's going on, figure out if we need to be doing anything differently. So I spent about 9 months having lots of conversations with our staff internally in different parts of the world, getting up to speed on the external debate. And it didn't start out as, you know, produce a policy, but actually what people were crying out for was a framework. They said, you know, we're trying to invent all these bespoke solutions, but we don't have any guidance. We don't know how to do this. We don't know where to start. So that's what I helped produce. I led the development of a human rights guidance note for the company, which basically said, okay, human rights, there's a lot of debate going on. It can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But for BP, we can categorize the human rights that we impact the most into 3 categories: into employee issues, so looking at labor rights, into security issues, and that's all about BP's relationship with both private and public security forces, because that's such an important issue around extractive projects, and then looking at local community issues, sort of all of our kind of good neighbor issues and how we impact the lives of people near our projects. And again, that helped a lot because it didn't give people the answers, but it gave people a way to kind of manage and consider these issues. So while I was doing that, I got to know this guy, John Ruggie, and it was during the first year of a 3-year assignment that he'd been given by the UN. His assignment came out of a debate over this proposed set of standards. They had a very long name. They were the draft norms, now I can't even remember the full name, the draft norms on the responsibilities of transnational corporations and other business enterprises with respect to human rights. Whew. So a committee drafted this proposed set of standards, and they were very helpful in that they spelled out topics that companies should pay attention to. So you should pay attention to labor rights, you should pay attention to environmental protection, to consumer protection. But they had a fundamental flaw, and that was that the preambular language said corporations, because they are now so big and powerful, they should have all of the same responsibilities as governments to protect, respect, promote, and fulfill human rights. So this draft was put out for consultation, and you can imagine what happened. So some campaigning NGOs said, this is fantastic, this should be law. A lot of business lobbying groups said, over my dead body, are we going to assume responsibility for all these rights? The government sort of saw this debate and said, I'm staying out of this, I don't know what to do with this. So when the Human Rights Council voted on this proposed set of standards, they voted it down. They said, clearly these things aren't going to work. But clearly there are issues here that we need to explore, and increasingly human rights abuses are being linked with corporate activity, so clearly we need to figure out what's going on. So that's where John Ruggie's appointment came out of. His mandate has been specifically to clarify standards of corporate responsibility with respect to human rights, including the role of governments. So it's been a 3-year mandate so far, and he's done it with so much kind of outreach and consultation that what he is doing is both reflecting what is out there in terms of expectations of corporate responsibility, but trying to kind of put it all in one place and in effect set a normative framework. So the bit of my story is that when I was doing this, I had just finished the guidance note, the human rights guidance note for BP, and was trying to figure out what my next BP job should be, and saw that this guy was doing this mandate, and the UN doesn't give anybody any resources to do these things, so I saw that he needed some help. And I know BP does these executive loans once in a while, so I wrote to John Ruggie first, and this was right after he'd put out his first report. And it was very clear that he was going to be interested in what works. So he didn't want to draft another international treaty. Those can be helpful, but it's a 20 or 30-year process often to negotiate something that would then have to be ratified by national governments. He's interested in the spectrum of things that are actually going to work. There's not one single tool that's going to solve the problem of corporate-related human rights abuses, but what's going to make a difference to people on the ground. So anyway, I arranged a secondment. I'm on loan to him from BP. So in 3 years of doing all this sort of research and consultation, he has produced essentially a framework for business and human rights, because nobody was agreeing kind of the fundamental principles. Companies were saying, human rights, that has nothing to do with me. And NGOs were saying, of course it does, it has everything to do with you. So he's put forward this framework. And the framework rests on 3 pillars. They are protect, respect, and remedy. That's meant to be the framework for business and human rights. So protect is all about the state duty to protect. So obviously government's duty to protect people against human rights abuses. It's fundamental to the whole human rights system. But the point is that it hasn't been applied rigorously or consistently to corporations. So states need to fulfill their duties. The second pillar is the corporate responsibility to respect human rights. And so this is to say that at minimum, clearly society expects companies to do no harm. We expect companies to respect human rights. This is to move everybody beyond that existential sort of companies have nothing to do with human rights. Okay, at minimum, do no harm. So the question then becomes, okay, what do companies have to do to prove to themselves, to prove to the satisfaction of themselves and their stakeholders that they are indeed fulfilling this responsibility? So I'll get back to that one in a second. The third pillar is about remedy. And this is about that people need greater access to remedy if they feel like they've been harmed by corporate activity. Because right now, if you feel like you've been hurt by a corporation, what can you do? Right? You can try to sue, but if you're living in an African country and you're trying to sue the African subsidiary of a company with headquarters in Europe and listed on the New York Stock Exchange, what on earth are you going to do? And that's expensive and it's complicated, and are you going to get any justice? You can try to start a boycott, but again, complicated. And if you've actually been hurt, is that going to redress harm? So this pillar of the framework just says, okay, well, there's a spectrum of grievance mechanisms from the factory and the project level all the way up to, the International Finance Corporation has an ombudsman whose job it is to investigate complaints of people affected by IFC-funded projects. So that's the framework. The Human Rights Council welcomed the framework in June, and it renewed his mandate for another 3 years, specifically asking him to develop practical recommendations within each of the 3 pillars. So again, this question of, okay, now we've got this framework, and that's great, but now what do? We need guidance. So the bit that I'm going to be focusing on is developing a set of guiding principles for the corporate responsibility to respect human rights. So what are the 10 or 20 or whatever it is things that every company needs to do? And again, obviously the challenge is to make it practical enough that companies can actually do something with it, but generic enough. This is supposed to be a global standard that cuts across all sorts of sectors. So that's the task. And again, whatever he comes out with, whatever we come out with in a couple of years, this doesn't have the force of law. But again, he's done it with so much outreach and engagement and getting submissions from all parts of the world and having these meetings in all parts of the world that, again, it reflects what is out there. And so hopefully it carries that weight. So leave it at that.
So let me try to tie what Tim said to what you're working on. I mean, the project at some level is agnostic about the mechanism by which these principles would become lived. I mean, it could be that it's up to states to start putting in place laws that actually make sure that these are somehow adhered to. It could be that it's NGOs driving boycotts. It could be that it is individuals who are in positions of power in corporations who, even though it is not necessarily their fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders, still want to try to lead in a way that they adhere to these standards, and at the same time have a set of shareholders who won't question the fact that they're doing everything they can to.
That's right. I mean, he will point to some specific places where the framework can be enacted, but I think you're right that he's agnostic about. I mean, he's not going to create anything or suggest the creation of one particular thing. That
or say this is the implementation of the corporate social responsibility movement, right? That we now look to corporations to read this, and this is somehow a reflection of what they must be.
Tim, how would you respond to the framework and what it is trying to achieve from the perspective that you have sketched for us?
I'm not sure I know. I mean, I think I'm not sure I know. I think there is there's a great benefit in having a dialogue about responsibilities and about values and about moral conditions. And so in that respect, I think it's really great to have that discussion, that debate. But I think the world's in such a bad place that I'm much more anxious to get the Chinese to quit arming the Janjaweed, or to get companies and financial services, institutions to quit stealing from poor people. So I think that's great, and at some level, that's what you do here, and you're educating all these students to go out and have a moral compass and have a framework for thinking about how you get these problems done. But for me, it's either at sort of that level, or it's let's take on the most pressing problems in the world and figure out how you get them done. How do you get greenhouse gases from destroying the future? How do you stop cigarette companies from selling cigarettes to people that are in the third world and ignorant about the consequences? That is sort of hard for me.
Can I ask the same question to Christine? kind of directly to respond, if you can, to what kind of Tim has sketched out in particular, the aspect of it that corporation qua corporation does not have moral responsibility. How does that fit with what you have been sketching? And then we'll open it up to everybody. I just wanted to get the two of them partly in conversation with one another, and just to see whether there are at odds completely with one another, there are overlaps, how does it exactly look, and then we'll open it up, okay?
Yeah, I don't think we're at odds at all. I mean, I would agree that the notion of corporate social responsibility, it has become quite ill-defined, and it has come to include everything from, you know, philanthropy to supply chain compliance. So I think that it's difficult, and I agree that it's not a helpful basis for dialogue and for progress. And I also agree that what we should be focusing on is, you know, what are the problems that are impacting people's lives on the ground, and what I am concerned with is how corporate activity actually does that. People are currently being hurt by business, and how do we fix that? And it's difficult, but I wouldn't agree with the notion of entirely separating the morality of people and of corporations. I mean, I understand where that comes from, and I understand that kind of technically and legally there is a separation. But I don't think people check their morality when they come into work. I don't think that they should. I don't think anybody wants to. And I also believe that society has an expectation, again, of corporations to do no harm. Of course, we expect, you know, people to do no harm, and we know people who work at companies, and we expect that they're not going to carry out their jobs in ways that hurt people. So that's what we're talking about. So I think in some ways we're in violent agreement, and it's just how are we framing this conversation, and to what extent it does make sense to separate the individual from the corporation.
I think we are a little bit in disagreement, because I don't think we can expect anything of corporations. We can expect a lot of governments, we can expect a lot of churches and synagogue, we can expect a lot of individuals, and I think your case, which I would have liked to read your research, I think is a classic example. Phil Knight looked the other way, you know, as an individual who was a large shareholder while they did, you know, terrible things in their supply chain. And the only reason that he stopped is because there was an outrage, and because he was being vilified, and his employees were saying, as individuals, screw this, I'm out of here, and people weren't buying his shoes. And for me, talk about the corporation, it's, you know, is mushy. Let's go out and find out anybody that's doing bad stuff and boycott their stuff and pass laws and get their employees to quit, and then they'll stop doing it.